Good morning, everybody. Can we start? My name is Kazu Toyoda. I'm a chairman of Japan Economic Foundation, which is a think tank for international economic affairs. Thank you very much for coming to this Brookings JEF Japan Economic Foundation collaborative forum. This Monday, early Monday morning. Thank you very much for coming. I hope we can all shake off sleepiness by listening and participating in a very stimulating discussion today. We at Japan Economic Foundation have been hosting forums like this together with prominent think tanks abroad, especially in the United States, Europe, and Asian Pacific economies, where we have strong ties, strong relationship with both in economy, politics, and in other important areas as energy and environment. This time we are honored to co-host the event with Brookings Institute, which is a very famous, international famous institution at the best timing when United States is hosting the 30th APEC summit in San Francisco, California this week. I am very honored to say that I had experience in participating the first APEC meeting in Canberra about 34 years ago, when I was working in METI, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, as a sort of personal secretary for METI minister. It was my honor. The APEC framework has participation from major economies, as you know, in Asian Pacific region, such as China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong and Russia, along with clearly the United States, Japan, 6 ASEAN countries. It is such a dramatic range of economies with different backgrounds. These 21 economic member economies account for about 40% of the total world population. And also their products account for more than 60% of the world gross output, meaning there is a quite significant importance in the gathering. And so I understand that various important meetings will be held, particularly hosted by the United States at the fringe of APEC summit, by including United States China summit meeting, IPEF in the Pacific Economic Forum ministerial meeting, and U.S. Japan summit meeting as well. However, as everyone is very much aware of, we are presently observing many disputes and conflicts, unfortunately, in the world, involving the APEC member economies. And there is no single country which is not affected, unfortunately. International economy is now influenced greatly by what is happening between Russia and Ukraine, and between China and United States. The recent bombing between Israel and Gaza will surely make another big divide in the world. On top of this, there are many more issues which are all complicated, like how China should treat Hong Kong and Taiwan, which is very close to Japan, when China claims both are domestic issues. Different understanding of sovereignty and international rules are making dangerous attempts to change the status quo by force. Actually, personally, I visited Taiwan twice last month. I don't know, I could enter China and be welcome, I'm not sure. but I hope I would be able to China again. So at present, we are observing the world where politics and economy are very closely linked, where many leaders of the economies seek for their own interests without considering the interests of others. Because of this, we must urge major world stakeholders to meet and find the right direction to go forward, search for ways to ease climate change that match individual economies at development stage, think about realistic energy source along with this, confirm the world order so that we can play fair games by following the rules that we once agreed internationally. If we are going to search for mutual prosperity and peace and restore the worsened world situation at the same time, I count on the occasions like the APEC summit, where major actors to be all present. I hope we will be aware of the key factor, a cooperative relationship under the rule-based economic and political system. I assure this will strengthen the world economy and restrain the power game. We are here today to discuss two important issues: energy and environment, energy and climate change, and also international trade policies in a world of geopolitical divide. We need to create a more secure environment for our regional economic development and lessen numerous disputes and conflicts going on around us, which will make no one happy at the end. Let us enjoy our talks and discussion, learn from each other, and draw our meaningful conclusions to make a proposal, hopefully to APEC-related meetings in the world. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to say thank you to Toyota-san for kicking us off in fine style. And I'm really delighted to be here this morning to direct traffic on the panel regarding energy and climate. We can see how important this issue is, but also how difficult it is to deal with in this time of geopolitical tension. And so this is a really timely discussion. I have the pleasure of introducing our panel quickly. If you'd like to know more about them, you can see them in the material that you have. To my immediate left is Jonathan Elkind. He is Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. He's also my former boss at the Department of Energy, so good to see you again. We next have Yukari Yamashita. She's the Managing Director at the Institute for Energy Economics Japan, somebody I've also worked with in the past. This is like old home days. And I'm also happy to see Jennifer Sclaru, who is the Assistant Professor of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University. And so we have a great panel here today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them. I'd like to start out, I think I'll start with you, John, and just go down the line. I know we've asked you to prepare just a few minutes of opening remarks, and so can you kick us off?
Yes, I can, but I'll use the microphone. Samantha, thank you very much, and to your colleagues at Brookings, as well as to the Japan Economic Forum Foundation for this opportunity to be with you today. When I first got the invitation weeks and weeks ago, I thought that's a very interesting set of topics. What I could not have known precisely at that time was exactly how important this set of topics would be for the meeting that is going to take place later this week in San Francisco. So well done to all of the organizers for that choice of topics indeed. Our first element of the program this morning goes to energy and climate issues. And if you'll forgive me stating something that is probably in the neighborhood of blindingly obvious, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to imagine a tenable future existence for people on this planet without solutions on climate change. A part of the complication is that it is equally impossible to think about solutions on climate change without baking into those solutions energy security that helps countries to sustain their economies globally. And we will have, and sadly, as Toyoda-san's remarks remind us, we have all of the other facets of human existence, both good and bad, from pandemics to conflict, from economic rebounds that complicate emissions profiles to other elements. And so we must think and deal with all of these challenges at the same time. Now, in the United States, again, I risk resorting to the blindingly obvious. Another complication that arises in the panoply of difficult topics is how to think about international collaboration and especially trade in this time. Trade is has become, oddly, one of the topics that is subjected to rather bipartisan skepticism, if not more, across the United States. And so we must deal with that reality very sensibly and carefully, because I'll assert that we need effective trade systems if we are to win on climate change. Look, for example, please, at the history of light-emitting diodes, LED lights, which may include some in this room, I can't tell. Very, very high efficiency, much more efficient than compact fluorescent lamps, even more efficient, more long-lasting than the standard incandescent bulbs that we all associate with our respective childhoods. LED lighting systems went from representing just over 1% to just under 50% of the global market share within a decade. All right, this is unheard of in the movement of new energy technologies. If you wish to see more on this, look at I can give you a citation to the International Energy Agency's work that highlighted this. But it is at that scale and more that we need to be moving climate solutions around the globe. And we do so in a time, and that was not possible, would only have been possible with an exceptionally central role played by trade. Now, let us acknowledge, as my last thought before I pass the baton, one of the huge difficulties that will be front and center in this week's conversations taking place in San Francisco is the set of challenges that the United States feels in regard to China under its current leadership. These are challenges that run from security issues, South China Sea, and more, cyber threats, industrial espionage, human rights violations, and more. The litany of concerns between the United States and China is long and is really troubling. It's very difficult to solve. But no solution to climate works without China being part of the solution. China will follow its own way of dealing with issues. We may have objections or concerns in the United States or elsewhere to some of them, but that's a core fact. So I've perhaps only scratched the surface with my remarks in calling out several dimensions of this conversation that are extremely challenging for us. I hope I don't start the day on a depressing note, but Samantha, with that, I will stop, and thank you very much. Very glad to have the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for providing some connective tissue between this panel and the one that follows about trade. Yukari, I'd like to pass the microphone on to you.
Okay, thank you, Samantha. My background is really strictly energy, and then maybe a little bit of climate change. So my talk will be limited to that, but I try to actually expand my thought to the trade as well today. I understand that this forum is designed to coincide with the APEC meeting. So I would like to say a few words on potential role of APEC in this maze of regional or global divide. APEC has a long history of cooperation with the principle of voluntary, non-binding, and consensus-based. Its coverage is uniquely vast and varied, as Toyoda-san has already mentioned, and it has 21 members. Newly agreed IPEF and Quad, inspired by a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, are also becoming active in this region. And I think, incidentally, IPEF starts today. I feel that in this divided world, what is important is to have a multi-layered frameworks for international collaboration or cooperation. Having variety of platforms with common members would eventually make things happen, I hope. We should promote the collaboration in a practical manner. Unfortunately, the world is more and more divided after COVID, or still it's ongoing, but after the pandemic. The recent energy crisis has shown us that the division is rather serious, and we are concerned. Upcoming COP28 is hosted by the UAE. Many people foresee a divide between the North and Global South may prevent fruitful discussions. In addition to the Ukraine crisis, Hamas attack on Israel took place, and the situation seems to be getting worse and unpredictable. So it feels as if we were all dreaming, and Paris Agreement was just an illusion, which never happened. Renewed concern on trilemma is back, and with more reality regarding how to secure affordability. In a way, similar to the COVID-19 vaccine, where the haves and haves not faced different fates, the widening or expansion of a divide over energy security in addition to climate change issues is becoming clearer between the North and the South. Such a divide does not stay within the concept of the developed versus developing countries. It can be seen among the developed countries, depending on whether they have resources and or technologies. It can also be seen among the developing countries, depending on their renewable energy potential. Moreover, even within each country, regional divide may be recognized depending on the robustness of locally available energy systems. Looking further within countries, issues related to increasingly expensive energy tariffs may become serious among individuals. Natural gas shortage, which was induced by power shortages in 2021, escalated by the Russian invasion to Ukraine. It was actually happening back in 2021, before the Russian invasion. Mainly Europe was hit hard and ended up purchasing natural gas from around the world after the Ukraine issue, especially LNG from the US. This took away a portion of LNG export to developing Asia. Thus, these countries went back to utilize cheaper and available coal. Anyway, the energy security concern made a strong comeback after these incidents. This energy crisis made it clear that both developed and developing countries are still in the need for fossil fuels in the process of energy transition. In fact, according to our estimation, Institute of Energy Economics Japan, 50% of energy use in 2050 might remain fossil fuels if the trend from NDCs continues beyond 2030. This very well indicates that there is a certain role which fossil fuels need to play during the transition period towards net zero emission. There is a good reason why fossil fuels remain during the transition period of decarbonization. Non-power sector, especially manufacturing sector with high temperature heat needs, are facing difficulty how to find a solution. APEC has a variety of member economies, including growing Asian countries and following Latin American countries. Moreover, worldwide electrification needs more batteries and motors. This increases the demand for critical minerals, and these minerals are known to be unevenly distributed, especially refinery capacities, very much in China, and it is rapidly becoming an economic security concern. To develop secure supply chain is necessary, not limited to energy. The climate change is a global challenge. It does not make sense unless the whole world tackles together. No one should be left behind. It is urgent to take an inclusive approach to work with the Global South. We need a balanced and inclusive approach towards carbon neutrality. The world must collaborate in tackling the critical climate change issues. For that, securing required resources with ample supply at reasonable cost is very relevant and essential because of the timeline. The APEC economies can take the lead, perhaps starting at small scale with like-minded voluntary members, then with other more recent cooperation platforms such as IPF and CORD, and maybe many others. Its movement would eventually become a global trend. That is maybe my wish, but I hope it is relevant to this APEC week. Thank you. Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you, Yukari, and thank you for pointing out the importance of fairness and equity in the green energy transition. Jennifer, I'd like to turn to you.
Thank you so much, and I'd also like to thank my colleagues at Brookings and the Japan Economic Foundation for this opportunity. And we did not coordinate at all, but somehow I think my comments are building on both of yours, which is exciting for me, and hopefully interesting for you. So against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine and U.S. China tensions and other geopolitical uncertainties, APEC's framing of energy system resilience has expanded beyond infrastructure resilience to include societal resilience and the concept of a just energy transition. For developing and developed nations to achieve APEC's energy and climate goals through a just transition, including some goals that have already been established, reducing energy intensity by 45% below 2005 levels by 2035, a doubling of renewables by 2030, and I'll talk in a minute about, or a few minutes about some of the potential future goals, we do need to think beyond traditional engineering resilience or restoration of infrastructure and supply chains to their prior functionality after shocks. We need to consider 3 other aspects of resilience that are interwoven with this societal resilience, all of which are affected by these geopolitical uncertainties and by climate change. The first is ecological resilience, or adaptation of energy systems and supply chains to mitigate the effects of future shocks through addressing these vulnerabilities. The second is social resilience, which includes health and environmental considerations and access to energy resources and electricity. And the last is economic resilience, so that ties us into the next panel, which includes costs of energy resources, costs of electricity, costs of infrastructure investments, and economic gains and losses, which include those employment issues. So cross-sectoral trade-offs affect these various aspects of resilience in developing nations in particular, as well as in developed nations. And measures to reduce emissions and bolster energy security can have positive or negative effects on agriculture, land use, water consumption and access, health, and employment. And these considerations are all key to a just transition. Now, the war in Ukraine has revealed global supply chain vulnerabilities for fossil fuels, creating challenges to social and economic resilience in APEC nations and beyond. And this is due to the supply shortages, which we've talked about a little bit already, and due to the price hikes, which we've also talked about a little bit already. And these challenges have also highlighted the roles of APEC nations as fossil fuel producers and consumers. And at the same time, they have encouraged APEC nations to accelerate shifts toward renewable energy and nuclear power to promote all forms of resilience. Also at the same time, as Yukardi mentioned, we have supply constraints on critical minerals due to these various geopolitical challenges. And those include lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and graphite, all of which are necessary for energy storage technologies. And Russia supplies and processes some of these minerals, and the tensions with China create further complications because China plays a major role in mining and processing most of these minerals. Just for context, Russia extracts and processes about 5% of the world's nickel. China processes almost 70% of the world's lithium and hosts over 15% of the mines. And most of the cobalt mines that are located in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where most of our cobalt comes from in the world, are owned by Chinese companies, and almost 75% of the refining and processing of that cobalt takes place in China. So all of these geopolitical considerations that we have been talking about in terms of conflicts have a major impact on these critical minerals. So with all of that, what can we expect to see at the APEC summit in terms of energy and climate, and what do I hope to see? So I think we can expect to see at least 4 types of discussions, and the first is a discussion of support for workers and communities affected by an energy transition. And this discussion will be crucial to engaging and supporting U.S. fossil fuel production communities, but also APEC's developing nations that rely on fossil fuel production domestically and for export-based revenue. Second, I expect that we will see a discussion of a U.S. proposal for a new aggregate goal for power sector decarbonization, because that's been mentioned recently. And that would be coupled with a new target for electricity from carbon-free or carbon-neutral sources by 2035. Third, I'm expecting that we will see a discussion of ways to reduce methane emissions. APEC nations reliant on coal, natural gas, and large-scale hydropower all have a special interest in solutions to methane emissions. And finally, I expect to see a discussion of mechanisms for clean energy infrastructure development and energy efficiency. And this can include regulatory frameworks that promote investment in infrastructure and technologies for clean energy, including hydrogen and ammonia, and energy efficiency. So with all of that, what do I hope to see? I hope to see discussion of collective efforts on supply chain security for critical minerals, which would benefit both producing and consuming nations. But I also hope to see a discussion of best practices and regulatory frameworks to promote a just transition for communities that host critical minerals. Beyond the energy security concerns linked to Chinese and Russian roles, justice issues affect all APEC nations involved in the critical minerals supply chain. And this is because APEC countries control most of the global supply chain for critical minerals. They account for about 70% of global mining and about 80% of global processing and refining capacity for these minerals. About 90% or more of global lithium is mined and processed in APEC nations. APEC nations mine and process more than 70% of the global supply of copper, graphite, and nickel, and 20% of the cobalt is mined in APEC nations. So you can see why mining and processing of these critical minerals would affect social and economic resilience of the host communities in APEC nations and the facilities they own in other nations. So considerations could include water, health and safety, and employment. And so with all of that, we can see why an APEC discussion of critical mineral supply chain security is important, but why this discussion also is relevant to the concept of a just transition. I also hope to see discussion of potential impacts of new clean energy projects on host communities. I've worked on this a bit in my research, and the siting of these clean energy projects can still have implications for water, health, employment, et cetera. And so APEC can support this through dialogue on best practices. And as broader framing, I hope to see discussions these issues at the intersection of energy, climate, food, and water in the context of a just transition. Many of APEC's working groups are already engaging on integrative themes, such as climate-smart agriculture, carbon-free energy sources, and the energy-water nexus. But I hope these discussions will include the impacts of energy transitions on water consumption and land use, food security impacts on energy use, and energy used to provide water in arid places, since many of our places are becoming more and more arid or at least unpredictable. And recognizing these types of cross-sectoral trade-offs and externalities can enable collaboration on synergistic solutions that promote the innovative, integrative, and inclusive energy transition that APEC leaders say they are seeking to realize. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our three panelists, I feel like, have really given us a broad view of the issue. So I have questions for each of you coming up, but if one of the others wants to pipe in afterwards, don't hesitate if you have something to add. And I'll start with John. The APEC meeting is a really interesting one because, as we've heard about, China is incredibly important for anything we do on climate, both as the world's largest emitter, but also as a very important supplier of so many materials. But China has been putting out a lot of signals recently about sort of going their own way in terms of climate and not wanting to be pushed by others. I'm remembering Xi Jinping's comment that China will proceed at its own pace. How can we read those comments? What should we take away from them going into both the APEC meeting and the upcoming Conference of the Parties meeting in Dubai? Do you have any thoughts on how we should interpret those and what we might expect?
Just a couple thoughts. For starters, I mean, nobody goes it alone on climate. So, I mean, everybody is stuck together. Like it or don't like it, it's just a fact. A second thought that is worth keeping in mind is China desperately needs climate solutions. China's own vulnerability in the face of both the sea level rise along its shores. If you look at the concentration of export capacity for China, it's all along the shores. If you look at inland flooding that has been increasingly prevalent all around the globe, China has been hit hard there as well. So all of the reasons that might incent action on climate apply to China no less than anyone else. China often declares that it is still a developing country. That is a storyline that is increasingly difficult to take at face value. I think that China is adjusting itself to the notion of playing a different role on the global stage. Now, nobody is faultless in this, right? So let's be clear about that. I have regretted the period in which China was saying that it would not engage with the United States because there were political tensions that were happening in other parts of our relationship. I kind of understand the motivation for it, but it's unfortunate and it's unproductive. I am glad that the signals now coming from Beijing suggest a willingness, a preparedness to re-engage. That is super important and positive, and one will see how far it goes in due course.
Thank you. And I'll note that there are, at least under the surface of the tensions, there's some good relationships among the people in the United States and in China who do the negotiation. And so that's always been a little bit of a happy point for me going forward. Yukari, you talked a bit about energy security. And energy security is clearly back based on current geopolitical events. It never really went away, but I think it went on the back burner for a little bit for many of us. But I'd kind of like to hear what you think about the role of energy security in pushing the energy transition right now. Are current events pushing the energy transition? Are they pulling the energy transition back? Is it a mixed bag based on what's going on right now?
Okay, I took the question in a different way, but what kind of influence the energy security back on stage has has done to the climate change issues? Well, the most striking change after Ukraine is that the world faced a sudden shortage of not only natural gas, but all the fossil fuels as well as electricity. And it also recognized the importance of fossil fuels during the transition period, as I have already said. Therefore, securing enough energy is very much essential, and it is an economic and social priority, as she also mentioned. Another change surrounding climate change issue is increasing concern for the critical minerals, as Jennifer really extensively mentioned about, which China seems to have good grips on refining capacity. So creating the supply chain alternatives is becoming an urgent economic security issue. Recognizing the potential, Indonesia recently banned export of their bauxite ore. Indonesia has already banned the export of nickel, which Indonesia is the world's second or third in the resource. And according to a press, China is still importing large amount of Indonesian nickel. Therefore, the picture seems complex behind the story. The resource nationalism has never really succeeded, as exiting from such economy is challenging. And yet, even renewables are becoming good target to support the idea, because not every country are well endowed with the renewable energy potential. Japan is, for example, has a national, the land space of the nation itself is about the same as Germany, but only half of its space is flat. And then yet, we have managed to have 20% more than Germany, the solar power capacity, and then our power generation is maximum by now. Therefore, it is very challenging for us to imagine to make it double or triple, as APEC economies are all expected. So the renewable energy resource is also not evenly distributed, and then we need to be aware of that. So the energy security issue is actually expanding in a way.
Great, thank you. And Jennifer, in your opening remarks, you brought up a question that I get asked constantly. And so I'm going to continue on that. And that is about supply chain security, particularly for critical minerals. We understand now that, particularly if you combine the APEC countries, they are incredibly powerful in their resources and their control of these materials. But on the flip side, you see U.S. policy that's really focused on nearshoring, friendshoring, doing these minerals here at home, the mining, the refining. What gives here? What does supply chain security mean in terms of minerals? And how is U.S. policy interacting with these countries in terms of dealing with supply chain security for these?
All right, so I'm going to tell you a truth. I had a speaker from Tesla come to talk to my class the other day, and I asked her almost the exact same question because she's in charge.
That means it's a good one.
Yeah. So what I was interested in at that time was understanding our new requirements for domestic content for critical minerals mining. And my understanding is that, and the second panel can probably address this better, but there's a financial component to it more so than an actual geographical component. So the U.S. can still be partnering with these other countries as long as there is a partnership that would enable that domestic content to be part of the solution. And frankly, the U.S. has some capacity for some of these minerals, but China really has a larger share. Russia has a share. Chile has a share when it comes to lithium. Democratic Republic of Congo, as I mentioned. So this really is a global issue that I don't think reliance on any one country should be solving. And therefore, having this domestic content requirement is understandable, but I think the context needs to be understood, which is if it involves these partnerships for development by multiple places. And again, I need to emphasize the just transition part, because a lot of these places don't have the practices in place and the regulatory frameworks in place to protect their workers. And to protect their environment, since this panel also overlaps with the environmental issues. So having those regulatory frameworks and best practices in place is one area that I think the U.S. can actually provide a lot of support, because my original reading when I first saw the Inflation Reduction Act and I saw that domestic content requirement was, I hope this is about protecting workers, and I hope this is about best practices in the U.S., used and applied elsewhere. And so again, I think that's one area where these types of partnerships can be useful.
Thanks, Sam. I'd like to kind of sharpen a little bit, even emphasize what Jennifer was just saying. It is extraordinarily hard to see how the critical minerals, in particular the processing segment, grows quickly enough for the indicated timelines under the Inflation Reduction Act, simply as a matter of the difficulty of siting and permitting new processing capability. I mean, this is a 7, 8, 12-year time horizon. Guess what? If you do the math, that's well beyond 2030 already. So it is really challenging. Now, the Treasury Department is still considering and will issue, supposedly by the end of the year, regulatory guidance about what constitutes a so-called foreign entity of concern. And this FEOC guidance will play a particularly important role in this space, determining whether, for example, the Ford Motor Company joint venture with CATL, the big Chinese-based battery company, whether it would or would not be in bounds for purposes of the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act. Given the sensitivities around issues with China, it seems tough to imagine that that's where things are heading. But this, to me, is a signal of concern because you simply can't build these industries in the United States or in partner countries overnight. It takes time.
Thank you so much for both of your points. And I would add that as Treasury and others think about how to scope these regulations, some of these partnerships can further Jennifer's points. The fact that if we keep some of these organizations within bounds and in partnerships, it means that we have more influence on the environmental aspects and how workers are treated, and it could be to our advantage in the Department of Justice, not literally, but figuratively. And so I hope we see that happen. I have a couple of questions from online that I'm going to ask, but if you can all start thinking about your questions. After I ask these, we'll come around with a microphone and we'll turn to the audience. But I'm going to combine a couple questions that I got from our online listeners, and I'm just going to open this up to the panel, so do one of these if you want it first. I get a lot of questions about whether, clearly climate change is a global issue, but we are looking at it in a lot of regional sorts of meetings in APEC and the G20, G7, and other meetings. But we also have the COP coming up, which is the large worldwide meeting. Did these discussions belong more in the smaller groups, in the larger groups? Are there certain issues that we should tackle in smaller groups versus the bigger ones? What is the interaction among all these different groups that are finding themselves talking about climate? Does anybody want to start there? You look interested.
I'm still thinking, but I mean, I truly believe there has to be value for all levels of discussion. I can't imagine how we could have a very meta-level, top-down discussion at a global level and not have these more local-level discussions. And I would argue that they need to be, no pun intended, drilled down even further to, the very local level in many cases, because companies have to implement these things that we're asking, right? And companies have local investments. And as John mentioned, there's siting and permitting considerations for some of these mitigation technologies. So, and again, supply chain issues. So I don't think we could have a discussion that isn't spanning the regional, local, and national, as well as the international.
Well, it may not be in this international fora, but the recent development of the recent energy crisis has made people start to talk. The reality, the hard reality, which was kind of wrapped up in the ideal balloon that we can meet the carbon neutrality by 2050. It was like how do you call it, the prayer that we keep saying. The recent visit to Europe made me realize that even in Europe, people started to discuss that it is actually very difficult, very tough to meet that carbon neutrality target by 2050, and what do we do? So that kind of discussion, small talk in very different the fora, would be beneficial to actually to keep, start going towards the reality and with the collaboration. I think that is constructive.
I agree completely. Promises are easy. Implementation is hard.
I want to just offer a couple thoughts that build on what Jennifer and Yukari had just said. First of all, I mean, it's easy to kind of lampoon the conferences of the parties, particularly as they balloon from one year to the next. The numbers that are now being talked about is 40, 50,000 people visiting Dubai for COP28, and it does beg some obvious questions about what the value is. But the value, it seems to me, is still clear, which is that this is the meeting of record each year where principally, and this is the important part, country delegations gather and they debate big topics. And here I want to emphasize strongly something that Yukari said, which was about the importance of mobilizing capital for the developing world. That will be, I suspect, arguably the biggest thread of the conversation that will take place in Dubai. In this regard, it is very fortunate, I would say, that the UAE is hosting this round of the Conference of the Parties, because certainly the UAE has a great deal of sophistication and exposure and engagement on finance issues globally, and they have signaled a readiness to try to make progress in this space. So whether it is the Loss and Damage Fund, whether it is questions around what multilateral development bank reform could be as it is made relevant to the business of mobilizing capital for clean energy in developing countries, or other related topics. I think that's an area that is promising this time around, though, as always, 198 different delegations will have very heterogeneous interests and perspectives, and so there's going to be a lot of brinksmanship, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of question marks down to the very end.
Following up, do you want to go? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Sorry, now I'm going to build on something that you said, so we'll just go around. So I was thinking in the context of the finance mobilization that both of you mentioned, technology transfer is also something that it really has to be discussed at this meta level as well. And of course, it needs to be discussed regionally and bilaterally. But having those meta level discussions enables all of those different voices to be heard, especially in the context of disaster relief that we're seeing going to different places, and the fact that climate change is driving a lot of those disasters. So having that context of we don't want to go back to this engineering resilience concept of returning back to what we had before, and we need to improve on it so that we can address future disasters, but also hopefully avoid them. So just the linkages between the disaster relief, the technology transfer, and the finance mobilization.
Building on to that, technology transfer is important, and I don't think we have utilized the low-hanging fruit enough yet. Like especially for the developing and the newly industrialized countries, energy efficiency improvement is yet to be done. I'm not talking about the new construction or new infrastructure. It is also about the already existing ones. This summer was very endurable in Asia, and then in Asia, the summer is becoming hotter and hotter. And then it is very urgent that we address this issue by introducing more efficient appliances, for example, like air conditioning, or even the insulation, which will, save the energy of air conditioning. Not only that, we may need to consider the new type of infrastructure, which is like a more distributed style, micro infrastructure, rather than the centralized big, energy consuming, what we have enjoyed in OECD countries, because we have to secure the energy access to everybody at the same time addressing decarbonization. Therefore, there is no room for wasting money. And then also, if the infrastructure of such distributed small-scale ones become available, we developed countries may also benefit because we are facing the aging infrastructure, which is huge.
Thank you so much. And I love the interplay. The less I talk, the better the panel is. But at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. And so we have a couple people walking around with mics. And so raise your hand and they can find you. Can you go back here?
Thank you very much.
If you could introduce yourself and where you're from.
Thank you. I'm Annika Hedberg, Senior Advisor to European Policy Center, a think tank based in Brussels. Thank you very much, first of all, for the great discussion. I especially appreciated the final remarks on energy efficiency, the dimension that is so often forgotten. Another question and topic that has not been mentioned, and which I often find is extremely important element to bring into the discussion when we're talking about access to critical materials and we're talking about the security of supply, is circular economy. So what role does circular economy considerations play in the discussions? What role should it play in the discussions? Thank you.
You meant the circular economy? Oh, it is very important. We did the estimation last year of the supply and demand balance of critical materials, critical minerals, and then it is based on the assumption that the current technology will go on, because we cannot actually imagine what new technology will economize the usage of the critical minerals. But we should not forget that there is a recycling potential, but you have to have the system in place so that you can recycle everything which is available, the other mining thing. Therefore, it is very much matters a lot, because then you don't have to dig out the new mine anymore. More than necessary. Thank you for the question.
So I really appreciate that your question not only builds on the concept of critical minerals, but also on the theme of last year's APEC summit. So that's fantastic, because I know that the ASEAN countries were looking at the circular economy as a solution, given that a lot of them are land constrained as well. And I will just share that one of the things I have learned recently, which some of you may already know, is that the electric vehicle industry is trying to find ways to recycle the critical minerals in the batteries so that they will need less of them, and therefore their supply chain will be more secure, but also then they don't have to worry about disposal as much because they can just take the minerals and move them to the next. So it's a land issue and a waste issue and also a circular economy issue for them.
And I'll just add the quick point that this has been slow to get started, not for any terrible reason, but just that the supply of outdated batteries is low right now. I think as we get more batteries, this industry will become more viable. Come back here, please.
Hello, I'm Elliot Hurwitz. I'm a retired person. I took courses across the street at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I want to thank the panel for a great presentation. Indonesia is a member of APEC, and they're a Muslim country. And considering the conflict in the Middle East, I wonder if the panel would like to discuss what the effects of that are Indonesia's point of view.
I'm happy to start, but others will. Indonesia is a super important emerging economy. It is among a class of countries with which the United States and other partners need to be working much more closely. Why? Because the projected and already unfolding scale of emissions growth, while Indonesia strives to increase quality of life, create jobs for its population, et cetera, it's a big ticket partner that we need to be working with. Now, I am not aware of any reason to believe that the conflict currently unfolding in the Middle East is likely to play any particular reason. I'm sure that Indonesian citizens and leaders have views of various ranges on that conflict in the Middle East, but I'm not aware of anything that has been said by anybody officially on behalf of the Indonesian government that would suggest any particular near-term impact. Maybe I'm wrong on that score.
Yeah, I'm not aware of it either, and I will say that prior to the current set of conflicts, I was in Seattle for side meetings for the APEC Ministerial for Energy in August, and many Indonesian government officials were there speaking to us, and all of them were very interested in partnerships within the region, within the Asia-Pacific region, and there was just a lot of support for bilateral and multilateral engagement from the Indonesian officials who were there.
And I'll add the quick point that Indonesia is one of the JETP countries, Just Energy Transition Partnership countries, that we're currently working on in terms of decarbonizing their electricity sector. Let's see, who do we have now? Let me go over here.
Hello there. My name is Ujjwala Pluri. I'm a trade analyst at U.S. Customs, Office of Green Trade and Sustainability. And my question for the panel is, in the past, our ancestors actually built very sophisticated urban centers and cities that integrated the environment and the nature around them into their lifestyle, the cities that they built. As policymakers, is there any sort of lessons we can take from the experiences of the past and integrate that with the modern advances we have made in terms of like renewable energy, sustainability? And so that's my question to the panel. Thank you.
I think this goes back, it dovetails really nicely with this concept of a just transition, because we have to think beyond just climate change and energy resources and think about these connections with the land, with water, with food production, in the ways that you're describing, you know, prior civilizations or communities have done, and some communities are still doing. So I think having those best practices in mind and just understanding those interconnections and the implications that these new technologies have for those interconnections is what we need to think about. Once we recognize the interconnections, then it is our responsibility collectively to ensure that those communities are able to continue, to thrive, not just from an energy perspective or a climate perspective, but also land, agriculture, water.
I'm sorry, please.
Okay. I wanted to mention that there are few countries where they try to build buildings in wood. And then that is because they would like to save as much as cement or all these energy-intensive materials not to be made anymore. And then also, it is actually to induce the wood industry to recycle their wood, because we have been, especially in Japan, we have decreasing experts on the wood industry. Therefore, it's not renewed. So we cannot expect these woods to absorb the CO2 as much as we expect. So all this kind of nature-based solution is becoming of our attention. There are many other things, and Andy, I hope that it will answer part of your question.
So two perhaps contradictory trends that I would observe, or factors, and then a thought at the end. The first factor that I would note, particularly about the United States, is that your question goes to land use issues, in particular zoning issues, that are a place of real discomfort often in the United States. These are usually very local in development, and so you range from a Houston, Texas, which does not have operating zoning laws, to different parts of the country where it would be unthinkable and where the sustainability objectives are very much more common. So that's one thought. A second thought that runs counter to that, in conversation with people of my kids' generation, I have been struck by two things that people who grew up in this country and are more like my age will find to be as striking as I did, which is the lack of interest to have a driver's license. I mean, for the non-Americans in the room, you're going to be thinking that this is one of these strange American things, but it's a real fact that they don't see it as a priority as people of my generation certainly did. And those same people are seeking walkable lifestyles and places to live and work. So this is a very encouraging factor that runs exactly counter to my earlier thought. And the last thing on which I'll end is, if you think this is an important issue here, look at sub-Saharan Africa with the youth bulge that is moving through their populations, incredible growth, incredible business opportunity for people that are in those marketplaces, and incredible importance of facilitating, supporting where it is appropriate, any ask in the direction that you're talking about of more sustainable cities.
Hi, Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. So listening to you, it sounds as if it would be possible to put together a sort of digital intelligence map of all the processes of critical supply chains of the minerals, the critical minerals you're talking about, also natural resources. But I'm sort of wondering what would be the right platform for debating that, because if you look at the United Nations, I mean, the majority of nations don't even have any critical minerals. Not just because of small island nations, but the Japan ambassador to Bangladesh invited me in 2010 to listen to, their problem that they literally have 200,000 people, or the 8th largest population, that there are no critical minerals in a large nation like that. So we definitely need APEC, but we need platforms which could also make the most sort of intelligent debate or reconciliation of the kinds of dynamics that you seem to be talking about.
I believe the IPEF, which starts today, has one session on that. And then I'm not sure about the APEC yet.
So the G7 does have a 5-point plan for critical mineral security, and there's also a mineral security partnership in the Asia-Pacific region. So I think there are some regional mechanisms and then some other framing mechanisms. But part of the reason I think all of us were bringing it up in the context of APEC is that we are hoping to see something that will bring all of these different countries together.
Great. I'd like to use just the last couple of minutes of this panel to ask a lightning round question. You've sort of hinted on my question. And that is, if you really had your druthers out of this APEC summit, what would you most like to see in the realm of energy and climate? What would be a happy outcome for you? Do you want to start, Jennifer, since you were talking already?
So I already listed all of the things I want to see. But primarily, I mean, I think I'll just end up reiterating. Because I don't think my opinion has changed, although you all have certainly provided more points for me to think about in your comments. But I think still this interconnection between food, energy, water, climate, land, and how that affects a just transition for local level communities in addition to these different nations.
Okay. Well, as I said in my opening remarks, APEC is a unique group of economies which are varied with both supply countries, energy supply countries and consuming countries. And then most importantly, it includes China, Russia, and the fast developing ASEAN. So without their within the collaboration within the APEC, we don't see the success of the climate change negotiation, nor the energy security issue to be solved in a good way, so that all the countries can achieve the target. Moreover, I think the APEC has an important wing within itself, which is ABAC, which is the group of business corporations which will collaborate and then try to achieve something which is meaningful under APEC. And then that is unique within the APEC. I hope that this business, the sector will contribute a lot into the future, because technologies are within the industrial sector or business sector, and then without them doing something, nothing will happen.
Great. John, what would make your day?
Hands down, a successful Biden-Xi visit. Yes, I admit that's on the margins. It's not core to the meeting itself. But I think nothing else is as important in establishing that greater collaborations are possible. I don't mean to be simple-minded. This will not fix single-handedly the various things that are sources of tension between the United States and China, but a positive and constructive engagement there, I think, is hands down the most important thing.
Great. Well, I hope you all will thank me in joining what has been just a terrific panel. So thank you very much. And we'll welcome the next panel to the stage.
So shall we start now? Yeah. Well, my name is Naoyuki Haraoka, Executive Managing Director of Japan Economic Foundation, collaborating organization in Japan. Well, I truly enjoyed the first panel because they talked about growing geopolitical risks, impact on energy and security issues. And we will talk about in this panel the growing geopolitical risks, impact on international trade. First, I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists here. First, sitting next to me is Professor Kawase. He is a distinguished academic in Japan, one of the leading international law experts at Sophia University. And also he's giving lots of advices to the Japanese government on the international trade policies. In particular, he is very much knowledgeable about WTO issues. And then next to Inu Manuak, she's an expert on WTO also, and appellate body in particular. But she has a wide knowledge of the trade policy issues. So I'm going to ask her in this panel mostly on the issue of IPEF. And next to Manak, Mr. Fuji, Kojiro Fuji, he's a lawyer. He's a very distinguished lawyer in Japan, belonging to Nishimura Asahi Law Firm, one of the most prestigious international law firms. And he is also, as in his resume, one of the most successful lawyers in Tokyo. And he is also an expert on digital trade. So technology has lots of impact on the international trade today. So we look forward to his remarks on the digital trade. And the last, as you know, everybody knows Ms. Mireya Solis. Thank you so much for organizing this event. And as you know, she's been working on Japanese economic trade policy for a long time. And she recently published a very interesting title book called Japan's Quiet Leadership in Reshaping Indo-Pacific. It's a very interesting book, and I look forward to hearing about her view on this book later. Okay, yeah, so let me see, I would like to start asking questions, and each panelist is expected to finish his initial remark in 7 minutes. First, to Professor Kawase, just a minute. Well, how is the multilateral trading system evolving in the light of growing U.S. China competition and the rise of economic nationalism? How handle CPTPP, RCEP, and WTO economic security issues? That's a very important concept in rising geopolitical risk. What is to be the relevant reform of multilateral or regional trading system, taking account of those security issues? So please, yes.
Hi, thank you very much, Haraoka-san, and a kind introduction, which I don't agree. It's kind of exaggeration. And good morning, everybody. It is my great honor to share my humble perspective with distinguished speakers and also guests in this room and online as well. As you heard, the Haraoka-san, have assigned two very critical the issues, to me. So I will do my best to address them within my very brief, 7 minutes. And so first, regarding the first topics, I have observed three noteworthy, shifts. And the first, it becomes more security-oriented, of course. And the second, more fragmented. And the third, less legalized. And the first, the trading system has become more security-oriented, conscious, which is clear to everyone. And this trend was created by the U.S. China rivalry, but COVID-19 pandemics and the war in Ukraine seems to have further accentuated this trend, of course. And in the WTO, long dormant security, the exceptions such as GATT Article 21 have been increasingly invoked both in the dispute and notification of the various trade restrictions to the WTO. And the major countries, in particular the US and China, have frequently imposed export restrictions on security at the ground, and have enacted and reinforced related laws and regulations. We have also seen the notable the cases of economic coercion by China. In response, the G7 summit in Hiroshima announced the launch of the coordination, the platform against such actions. And the state library has focused attention on the weaponization of interdependence. So to eliminate so-called choke points, the major countries have been keen on the supply chain resilience in critical sectors and key goods, such as semiconductors and EV batteries. And not only China, but also even the United States has introduced industrial policy measures based on the security ground, including IRA and the CHIPS and Science Act. And emerging frameworks such as IPEF and the EU-US TTC are also paying more attention to the economic security. And regarding the second question, while the WTO negotiations have been, no, not the second question, I'm sorry. The second point is, the fragmentation of the trading system. While the negotiations in the WTO have been stagnant, the number of the RTA notified to the WTO reached a record high in 2021. The mega FTAs and bilateral FTAs between the major economies have been successfully concluded for the last few years, such as USMCA, RCEP, and CPTPP, and economic security-oriented forums such as IPEF, APEC, and EU-US TTC are promoting a so-called friendshoring. And finally, the trading system has become less legalized and more informal. The reluctance of the US to engage in a legally binding trade agreement with market access commitments has given rise to the more cooperative format. This includes, of course, IPEF, APEC, bilateral forums such as the TTC and the Japan-US Economic 2+2, as well as more sector-specific frameworks such as CHIPS 4 and the Mineral Security Partnership. This status quo leads to, his second question, which is how CPTPP, RCEP, and WTO deal with economic and security issues, and how these trading system can be reformed for this purpose. In principle, free trade is not incompatible with economic security. That is very important. Under the open and multilateral trading system, an economy can easily find an alternative source of supply and alternative market in the face of emergency or external shocks such as those I mentioned here so far. And this is a key message of the World Trade Report 2023, which was recently released by the WTO. And I would like to echo this message right here. While the recent the crisis and heightened geopolitical tension have called for de-risking, a drastic decoupling of the world market would be unrealistic for any economy. So, given the intricate supply chain and deep economic interdependencies, as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said last week, and even for the United States, the goal is not decoupling, from China. That is why the open and multilateral trading system made possible by the WTO must remain the foundation of the world trading system. The bottom line, therefore, is to regain the effectiveness of the WTO. To this end, the success in the upcoming, MC13 is the first and the most foremost, essential. Among the wide range of the agenda items floated so far, the dispute settlement reform to reactivate the dysfunctional appellate body and the institutional reform to streamline the decision-making process and restore the negotiating function, the most urgent. Digital trade negotiation under the joint initiative statement initiative were expected to make substantial progress by MC13, but it is unfortunate, as you already know, that the United States has withdrawn its support for the data free flow rules. That said, the message does not underestimate the importance of the regional arrangement and the emerging cooperative framework so far. The IPEC Pillar 2 agreement, for example, that shed light on the transparency and the operational aspect of the supply chain to address the issues such as supply chain disruption that have never been adequately addressed by the traditional trade agreement. And CPTPP and RCEP also reduce the cost of the supply chain development by eliminating the tariffs and the other non-tariff barriers. These agreements complement each other and in contributing to supply chain resilience in the region. We could do more to address economic security in conventional trade agreement. One realistic option is a guideline on export restriction for the essential products such as foods, energy, critical minerals, and the medical supplies. This actually has already been partially achieved by at the WTO by several MC12 ministerial declarations. The G7 cooperative framework for the economic coercion mentioned above can also be implemented through these trade agreements. Some WTO members, including the United States, have advocated for the complete self-judgment of the security exception. This will create a big loophole in the trade agreement to undermine the stability and predictability of the trading system. It may also be a double-edged sword, even for the United States, because China has put forward a concept of a comprehensive national security that covers a very, very broad range of the 15 policy areas, including the economy, ecology, and even culture. The invocation of the security exception should be still, a subject to the moderate ex post review and multilateral surveillance under the trade agreement. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
So much, Professor Kawase, for introducing such a comprehensive picture of the multilateral regional trade frameworks dealing with possibly economic security issues. I'm certainly encouraged by your remarks that, the multilateral free trade system is not incompatible with economic security. The second speaker is, in accordance with the seating arrangement, I'm going to ask Dr. Inu Manak to respond to the question, can CPTPP and RCEP be effective in developing resilient supply chains? On IPEC supply chain agreement recently concluded, how can IPEC be effective in achieving resilience of supply chain? What would be its overall contribution to trade governance? What would be a key to success of IPEC proposed network in the agreement responding to risk of supply chain disruption? Please.
Great. Thank you for that question, and thank you to the Japan Economic Foundation and the Brookings Institution for hosting us here today. It's great to be here. So the question, looking at the word resilience. It's almost become a catchphrase of the Biden administration's trade policy, but what does resilience actually mean in practice? And is this word even useful to describe the potential outcomes of the current policy that we're pursuing, such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? So when I think about resilience, I think about how we might build it. And I would say that first, countries need sufficient trade links in place from which to deepen their economic ties. Therefore, the precondition for resilience is a robust trading relationship with the institutional infrastructure that comes with it that can support collaboration and information exchange. Typically, this would be through a trade agreement, and that would reduce barriers to trade and include measures that support trade facilitation. When we reduce the friction in our exchanges, supply chains naturally become more agile. And when we build institutions, we provide the forum to respond to emerging challenges as they come our way. And over time, the hope is with some trade institutions, particularly if you build a secretariat that can help house a central area for you to talk and discuss about different issues, that through learning and adaptation, these institutions can become far more responsive over time. Nowadays, however, I think when you talk about trade in Washington, what I just described is the traditional approach to trade. It's embodied in trade agreements like the CPTPP, which, for example, used a very innovative approach to rules of origin with supply chain links firmly in mind through accumulation. Now, this allows materials that are produced in one CPTPP country to be used in the production of something in another of its member countries and still qualify as an originating product. And non-originating material counts towards the originating item once it's been substantially transformed. Now, RCEP contains similar rules. This all helps integrate supply chains. Now, CPTPP did do much more than RCEP to reduce barriers to trade among its parties. However, because of the slow pace of ratification, I think we just wrapped it up in May of this year for the TPP, the gains have not yet been fully realized. This will take some time. The United Kingdom has become the next member to join that queue, and there's others that are lining up as well. So I think the potential of this regional agreement could be quite large in the long run. But it's missing some partners as well. So we don't have South Korea, Indonesia, or the Philippines involved, and including them would make the gains even bigger. The RCEP, by contrast, includes commitments that are less extensive than the CPTPP, and it leaves out issues such as labor, environment, and climate, things that I think are generally accepted as something that we should be putting in our trade agreements today. Despite this, a third of RCEP exports stay within the pact. And some estimates suggest that RCEP could add up to $500 billion to world trade by 2030. So trade between the RCEP partners runs very deep. And then there's IPEF. So I'm finally getting to your question about IPEF because it takes a bit of setup. It's the administration's signature trade deal. We should be getting an announcement, maybe tomorrow, Wednesday, on the trade pillar. Now, can it increase supply chain resilience and trade governance in the Asia-Pacific? I think if you look at recent data, it would suggest that this is not going to be an easy task. So economist Mary Lovely at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, right across the street, recently showed that IPEF countries have actually concentrated their trade links among fewer countries. So there's less trade diversification among IPEF countries. And in addition to that, they have concentrated their links with specific countries, mainly China. So China accounts for about 30% of all their imports and 20% of their exports. Reversing this long-run trend, which has been happening over a decade, is going to be really difficult for IPEF to unbundle because it is a break from traditional trade agreements. How do you replicate this process without creating a trade agreement? So in many ways, when I look at IPEF and what it could become, just looking at the supply chain pillar itself and the structure of that as a model for what the trade pillar might be, I would say that it has a governance structure that they're trying to establish without the underlying foundations of robust and predictable trade links that come from a trade agreement, a traditional one. So let's take a look just at some of the elements of the supply chain agreement, which was finalized in May, and we saw the text of this in September. The text is full of hortatory language. We have a lawyer who can tell you all about what that means. And essentially, there's a lot of things that the parties intend to do, not a lot of things that they're obligated to do. And in addition to that, there's no clear means of enforcement or compliance. So again, in principle, great idea to create this governance structure, but then how do we enforce the rules that we create? The supply chain agreement sets up 3 distinct institutions. One is the Supply Chain Council, supposed to develop action plans to help the parties coordinate on what they think are key goods in critical sectors, yet to be defined. There is the IPEF Crisis Supply Chain Network, which will act as sort of an emergency communications forum to help governments respond to supply chain disruptions. And then there's the Labor Rights Advisory Board, which will identify labor rights concerns and offer recommendations to address them. Now, building institutions takes a lot of time. I think we heard that from the previous panel, and we've seen a little bit of that in comments already. And it's hard to predict when these new bodies are going to be able to actually deliver what they're trying to do, and whether they can also do that in time for the next exogenous shock to the trading system. So I think that it's not obvious to me that creating this additional layer of institutions is the most efficient means of addressing the range of global problems we can be faced with in the supply chain world. And I would say, for instance, the WTO has a lot of existing institutions and infrastructure to monitor global trade flows and bring its members together to discuss emerging trade problems. And at the start of the pandemic, I argued that WTO members should create a rapid response crisis management system where essentially it would be an early warning mechanism where members could alert when there was a supply chain shortage. That data would be available to firms, and they could respond without the direction of the government, a much more bottom-up response to crisis management. But like lots of my writing, nobody paid attention to that, so it was okay. But we didn't get that early warning system. We're trying to do something now in IPEF that's replicating that idea. We'll see what happens with much fewer members at the table. I'm skeptical. So I would say, in addition to creating these institutions, we may not necessarily change the volume of trade that's happening between the members of this new agreement. And we also don't know how, if you look at the supply chain agreement, say you're a firm, how do you interpret that? What does that mean for you thinking through your investment decisions? I would say most firms right now are scratching their head when they see what that pillar produced. So we have to see what firms do, and if you look at the text of the agreement itself, it seems like an agreement among governments to share information, and there's really not a clear understanding of what the role of the private sector is in monitoring supply chains as well, and what information they're going to voluntarily give to the governments in order to support these efforts. So this is all to say that I think the key to success of any resilient supply chain strategy is going to be trade. And it's going to be creating the linkages through trade and deep economic ties in the region, increasing firm-to-firm interactions, because when you build those linkages, you care a lot about those supply chains. And so that also requires lots of trust building, which takes plenty of time. So the trade pillar, which hopefully we'll get this week, I think is the key to success of the supply chain pillar, and they're going to work together. And while the jury is still out on what the content of that trade pillar is going to include or exclude, like digital, I think that IPEF countries are going to have to do a lot to build resiliency into existing institutions at the same time. So let's not abandon efforts at the TPP, at the WTO, and RCEP to also deepen links there, because I think we should not put all of our money on IPEF to solve our supply chain problems. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for your excellent and objective analysis on everything. WTO, CPTPP, RCEP, and IPEC. We are moving to the next speaker, Mr. Fujii. The question is on the emerging new issues on trade rules. Digital trade is one of the really key issues. So how and what are to be achieved for building up rules for digital trade? Mr. Fujii, please. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My apology, mic is not working, so thank you very much. My major practice here is competition, international trade, and public policy. And the digital trade is fascinating because it's a mixture of those. And then my career also relying on my experience here in DC working as a lawyer and also working in the Japanese government trade divisions. So for the digital trade, I will first briefly look back on the major progress in the past 10 years in terms of digital trade matters, and briefly would like to highlight a critical issue concerning the sudden change in the U.S. stance in digital trade discussions. Secondly, I will try to define the significance of a recent additional approach to international data governance matters, which go beyond the trade negotiation path. So starting from digital trade rule, as you know, in the past 10 years or so, there have been notable developments in international rulemaking to promote the digital economy. Countries have begun to conclude regional trade agreements which narrowly and explicitly establish rules for important issues concerning digital economies. The CPTPP is the first important attempt to establish comprehensive, in-depth norms to address key issues concerning digital economy on a significant scale. It provides rules pertaining to cross-border data transfer, deterrence of localization of computer-related facilities, and protection of source code. And these key achievements are followed with slight variation by the subsequent important RTAs such as USMCA, the Japan-US Digital Trade Agreement, and the Japan-UK EPA. And furthermore, last month, Japan and the EU agreed to increase the commitment to ensure cross-border free flow of data and the obligation not to adopt or maintain measures or prohibit or restrict cross-border data flow in the next phase Japan-EU EPA. And it should be noted that all of these advanced regional digital trade rules provide their members with exceptions for legitimate regulatory autonomy. They are based on a careful balance between the liberalization of digital commerce and the state digital policy autonomy. Those public policy exemptions will ensure that the restrictions or government interventions are based on legitimate purposes and are rationally structured and designed to achieve such purposes. This enables member countries and business to create mutual trust and provide predictability and a stable environment, which is important for business and civil society. Rational policy and regulations are in principle valuable for every stakeholders. So although it seems that the US has recently suspended its discussions of advanced international digital rules in the IPEF as well as the WTO, because it concerns regulatory autonomy, I think it is desirable for US to come back to negotiations very soon. Meanwhile, we are seeing an arguably more important additional approach to strengthen international data governance regarding data. The concept of data free flow with trust was proposed by the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at the World Economic Forum, and the subsequent discussions has been led mainly by the G7. The G7 Digital and Tech Ministerial Declaration of this April endorses the establishment of institutional arrangement for partnership to bring governments and stakeholders together to operationalize the DFFD through principle-based, solution-based, evidence-based multi-stakeholder cooperation. It also identifies the 4 priority areas: data localization, regulatory cooperation, trusted government access to data, and data sharing. We see significant awareness and efforts to involve a broader range of business and social views, not only the so-called big techs in the framework of DFFD, particularly under the new IAP, and Japan is preparing to take an initiative in this respect. In parallel with the DFFD, international cooperation has made progress in defining and establishing proper norms for government access to data. In December 2022, the OECD Government Access Declaration, which contains 7 principles for government access, was adopted. Those principles require legal basis, legitimate aims, transparency, supervision, and effective remedies, among other things. These principles were also endorsed in both the G7 Digital Tech Ministerial Declaration and the Trade Ministerial Declaration this year. Last but not least, we have seen significant development enhancing international cooperation for effectively regulatory enforcement as a reaction to digitalization. As more concerns over the effectiveness of regulatory enforcement, including police law enforcement, are raised as a result of large number of cross-border data transfers, it is important to ensure that investigative authorities can have access to data located in foreign countries to the extent necessary and adequate. International cooperation is warranted to avoid conflicts between national jurisdictions. For that purpose, in addition to building multinational framework, such as the Convention on Cybercrime, international collaboration can be also achieved through the establishment of bilateral or regional frameworks as exemplified by the U.S. Crowd Act International Executive Agreements and the EU Electronic Evidence Regulation and Directive. As a next step, I think Japan should also build this type of framework of bilateral or regional agreements with like-minded countries sharing internationally recognized principles, such as those encompassed by the OECD Government Access Declaration. As illustrated by the DFFD's emphasis on trust, issues of government access and law enforcement coordination, the scope of member countries, and the depths of cooperation to be required in such international agreements are not only depending on economic considerations. Rather, the scope and depths of such agreements are likely driven by constitutional values, such as the value of law, rule of law, due process, judicial independence, and freedom of expression. In that sense, advanced digital international rulemaking has a geopolitical potential to strengthen the alliance of countries embracing those constitutional values and principles. This concludes my statement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fuji, for this excellent presentation. In particular, I really appreciate your introduction of a wide range of activities undergoing on rulemaking process in the digital trade. Let me see. So the last speaker is Mrs. Solis, and my question is, what should be the role of APEC given the U.S. China divide? How can the U.S. hosting APEC meeting this week contribute to restoration of rule-based global economic system? What are the perspectives of APEC members regarding the reform of the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism? Please, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's a tough act to follow. We've had wonderful presentations, and let me take that very important question that focuses on the role of APEC, given that this week is a leaders' meeting, and there's going to be a lot happening throughout the week. And I would like to address it by focusing on 2 main issues. One is more generally why APEC matters. And the second one is looking at this APEC 2023, what role can we expect the United States to play? What are the opportunities there, and what are the challenges? Is the mic not on? Or? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I thought the mic was not on. So we already heard through the morning some background about APEC, and I just want to emphasize what a unique grouping this is. So it's been around since 1989. It's 21 economies in the Asia Pacific, and it's a grouping that works on the basis of consensus, and it generates voluntary, non-binding commitments. Now, I think that APEC, sometimes people do not focus enough on the grouping, but it has a very important role to play, and I would like to highlight why. And there are 4 reasons that I can think of at this specific juncture. One is the essential mandate of APEC is to promote economic integration. And it does so out of the recognition that the member economies have really thrived by embracing economic cooperation, by thinking of ways in which they can link their economies further and tap on those benefits of economic efficiency, predictability, and so forth. And at the time when economic nationalism is on the rise, we've heard it in the first panel, we've been hearing it now in the second panel, I think that this mission of APEC becomes even more central. We need more platforms that make the case as why trade is an important part of the solution, whether it's about increasing level of well-being, whether it's about addressing economic security. That's one, I think, very important mission of APEC. Second, I think that APEC thrives or excels when it acts as a pathfinder or incubator, a laboratory of sorts, if you will. And APEC has a good trajectory in bringing its members to think through about some of the most challenging issues and then issue standards that are consensual, non-binding, but that help us advance thinking and practical solutions on how we tackle them. So APEC, for example, has done in the past work to liberalize trade on environmental goods, to advance the energy transition, and again, thinking of the bridges between our 2 panels, but also making the case for a moratorium on customs duties for digital products. And I think that there's therefore that potential that APEC can help us think through and map out what are the sort of issues that we should be tackling going forward. A third important element of APEC is that it has become a jump-off point for some of the most important trade negotiations, regional trade negotiations. And what we have here is what we've seen in the past is that a subgroup of APEC economies have decided that they want to take it further, and they are going to negotiate deeper market access commitments, are going to negotiate the specific rules to govern their economic transactions. And some of the most important megatrade agreements that have already been mentioned in the panel here are conformed by APEC members. And that is the TPP, now CPTPP, and certainly the Regional Comprehensive and Economic Partnership. So if you want to understand where the energy is in trade agreements, then you should be looking at this space. And finally, I think that a huge asset of APEC, one that we're going to see this week in full manifestation, is the Leaders Summit. And the fact is that we know how hard it is to get the leaders' attention, how hard it is to get into their schedule, and the ability to bring them all at one venue and in a grouping that is going to focus primarily, but not exclusively, primarily on practical ways to facilitate economic cooperation. That is a huge asset to bring to bear. And it's not just about economic cooperation. We're going to see a lot of bilaterals going forward this week, and that is a diplomatic heft that the APEC grouping brings. Now, let me bring it to this year and this host, 2023, and the role of the United States in this APEC meeting. And I would say that there are opportunities, but also challenges. And I frequently, when we talk about trade and economic security and international affairs more generally, it's such a sobering conversation that I want to talk about first the positive side, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges. Now, I would say that this APEC, I think, is very, very important for the United States. It is very important because it allows the United States to begin to put forward what its vision is for economic engagement. And the Biden administration has placed utmost priority in the Indo-Pacific region. And it has accomplished a lot in terms of reactivating diplomacy. There have been a number of multilaterals that have been successful or have great potential. They largely have been on the security cooperation side. With APEC and IPEF, this is where we're going to begin to see where the United States can provide a better rounded strategy for this very important region, because those are the themes that come front and center when we talk about APEC and IPEF. Now, the United States comes to this APEC, I think, in a good place, in the sense that its economy is doing well. And therefore, I think that one of the messages that we're going to see going on this week is that this strong American economy can provide an engine for growth. And therefore, these back and forth flows of trade, investment, and so forth can be built on the back of American economic strength. So that is something that I think will see played out. I think that the themes that the Biden administration has chosen for this APEC resonate. They resonate because we live at times of turbulence. We live at times when the world economy has been buffeted by different shocks, when we face the real long-term challenge of climate change. And therefore, if you run with the themes of resilience and sustainability, that's going to find resonance. How you define those terms and you actually deliver practical outcomes, I think is going to be the challenge. But in general, for the APEC agenda this week, I think we're going to see work streams on the just energy transition, for example, food security, disaster risk reduction. And that are all very important issues that need to be addressed. But there are going to be headwinds. And in order to organize my thoughts, I decided to think of them in terms of 3 Ds, 3 different challenges: divides, distraction, and domestic politics. So let me just walk you through very briefly each of these challenges. Divides is the theme of today's event, right? Geopolitical divides. And here what we have is a grouping that is very diverse, 21 member economies. And I think that is the strength of APEC, but also it's a very important liability at times of fragmentation and times of geopolitical division. And we already began to see this as to who gets invited, which leaders get invited or not to the APEC meeting. And I think that it's going to be difficult for the United States to advance a more full-fledged agenda when you have members like China and Russia, where there's been a lot of tension in U.S. China relations, but also in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Add to that now the conflict in the Middle East, and I would say that that's creating a lot of concern about the flare-ups of conflicts in so many different parts in the world. But also, we should also be aware that the conflict in the Middle East is affecting the domestic politics of APEC members in very different ways. So they come to this meeting coming from very different places. And this is something that's going to color, I think, a lot of the discussions. Now, these 3 Ds are not compartmentalized challenges. They bleed into one another. And I think that that also then results into a possibility that the APEC agenda itself might become somewhat neglected or becomes a sideshow or does not receive the full focal point that it should become because we are distracted by other issues. So there are 2 events in particular that I think if you ask what the media is asking about when we ask for commentary, that's what they're asking about. They're not asking so much about the APEC agenda. They're asking about the Biden-Xi meeting, and they're asking about IPEF. And that, where does that leave the APEC agenda? Now, of course, it's very positive that President Xi and President Biden are going to meet. That's certainly a good sign. And it's hopeful that perhaps we'll see some stabilization on that, of that relationship. And we're all trying to see if there's going to be progress, say, on restarting military-to-military communication, whether there's going to be anything else. But I would also say that we should be, practical and pragmatic, and there's a lot of competition built into the current U.S.-China relationship, and this meeting is not going to change that structural fact. But nevertheless, it's positive that this is happening. Now, when it comes to the other big item for this week is IPEF. And, when the Biden administration launched IPEF like a year and a half ago, many people expected that this APEC may be the time when most, if not all, of the negotiation would be able to conclude because it was such a natural endpoint when the United States plays host to these important meeting and with all the dignitaries coming and so forth. But the supply chain pillar has closed. I think that the other 2 pillars where there is significant progress and they're close to be finished is on anti-corruption and clean energy. But the trade pillar continues to bedevil us, continues to be a challenge. And continues to be a challenge, I think, also because of domestic politics here in the United States. it's very hard to negotiate when you don't have a domestic consensus as to what should be the parameters, the goals, the objectives, the tools of trade policy. And it saddens me to say that I think that is the current situation here. And that's why we're seeing the United States very suddenly change direction when it comes to the digital element, and then pulling out from the WTO e-commerce talks when it comes to data flows, source code, things that the other panelists have mentioned, and suspending the digital negotiations in IPEF just a few days before the meeting taking place. But also, it's not going to close because from what we can gather, it's very difficult to get the kind of binding labor standards that the Biden administration is very committed to in IPEF. And that's still not ready. And therefore, that I doubt that there could be much announced this week on that front. And I think this brings us back to what has been the perennial question about IPEF. Can you get more with less? Can you get more binding standards, labor standards, without the market access commitments? And so far, it hasn't been able to. We haven't been able to find an answer in the yes to that. And now this means that the IPEF negotiations, if they're not going to close and the more sensitive issues are going to move to 2024, this is going to happen in the context of the presidential election here in the United States. And the TPP and IPEF are very, very different. But there's an element of deja vu in the sense that there has been a sharp turn in a U.S. position, and when we're trying to advance an important economic initiative in the middle of a presidential election. So everybody in the region is going to be wondering, what is this going to be like next year? And just to finish very quickly, my fourth thing would be the dispute settlement. And Haruka-san, you asked me, but you have here the trade lawyers and the WTO experts, and they can provide obviously a much more informed answer than I can. But I would say that 2024 is also a very important year because the WTO members have given themselves to 2024 to have now, to bring back, to have a functional dispute settlement mechanism. And because the WTO ministerial is going to take place in February, and now we have APEC now in November, it gives an opportunity for members to touch base, to try to continue to advance the discussions towards some kind of result in February or later regarding the dispute settlement mechanism. For those of you who are not familiar with the issue, the appellate body ceased to operate as of 2019 because the United States has blocked appointments because it has deep concerns about the operation of the dispute settlement. There are a number of issues. One that I think is very front and center in the U.S. complaints is a claim of judicial overreach. And what has happened is that APEC members have responded differently to the crisis in the dispute settlement mechanism. Some of them, not others, have joined an interim appellate arbitration mechanism because they're very concerned about rules not being enforced, because with the appellate body being in limbo, that means that if you, as a member of WTO, if you receive a negative panel ruling, you can appeal to the void. And therefore, that ruling doesn't really get implemented. And that interim arbitration mechanism is geared to tackle that issue. So members pre-commit to go into this arbitration mechanism. Now, where we stand today is that the United States, for the past several months, has circulated some informal proposals, I think like 30, on potential fixes. And I imagine that there are all kinds of responses. And it's not clear to me, and I would welcome to learn more from the panelists, as to what shape would the appellate body take after these discussions. I think that central point has not yet been consensus on that. And to me, that is going to change, it's going to be so defining of the future of the dispute settlement mechanism, and so defining of the ability to sustain a rules-based trading system. Because again, if we don't have rules that can be enforced, it's going to be very difficult to protect this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for touching upon the WTO appellate body question. And I really appreciate you. And in particular, APEC, you mentioned the interdisciplinary nature of APEC and broader range of agenda setting. Those should be, I think I agree with you, very useful in mitigating confrontation, geopolitical risk. Well, sorry about my poor time management, but anyway, to attract people's attention and interest, I would like to give all the panelists a second round question. The first question is, if you don't mind, I would like to ask Mireya again, and question of the, let's say, what is the possibility of U.S. coming back to TPP? In that, related to that question, the labor adjustment law, for trade liberalization, losers and winners are coming, born, and how to compensate for losers. And to our knowledge, in the US, labor adjustment law worked to some extent in the past, but it's not working anymore. Why? So that's two questions to give to Mireya.
All right. So, I think that not in the short term for sure. I think that the politics of what I just described don't give us a lot of hope that the U.S. is going to go back to the CPT or request accession to the CPTPP. I think that we're reaching the point where perhaps it will become clearer that if the United States wants tangible economic benefits, he needs to be able to put on the table market access. So perhaps we'll need to let the IPEF process work itself out, and we see what that can deliver and what it cannot deliver. And I think that any future possibility, I think that the United States would come asking for some changes to the existing agreement, certainly on supply chain and other items. And whether the counterparts are willing to entertain some changes to the CPTPP is, I think, critical. The line so far is that no, you must take it as it is. So that will be an interesting thing to see happen. But I believe that another important element of what would enable the United States to come back is precisely to have better domestic policies that enable workers and others, communities, to deal with economic change. And I think that in the past there has been a specific program to provide some benefits to workers displaced by trade. There was a lot of problems with that program. But I think that in general, I think that the problem was that it identified free trade agreements as a source of hurt. And when in fact we should be thinking about how we enable adjustment, social adjustment, the ability to reskill, the ability to move, change to a different part of the country if you want to get another job. And therefore to think about those programs as adjustment to economic change more broadly, because we're going to see a lot of change coming from the technological revolution that we are witnessing today. We're going to see a lot of change because of energy changes and so forth. And the problem is, I think, that this was done as a quid pro quo way in a manner that did not really address the underlying problems at hand, and a problem that created a sense that trade was a harm that we should all be protected from, instead of thinking that, yes, it does bring very significant challenges that can be concentrated in specific groups or geographies, and we should be able to offer that, but we should be able to offer broader means to adjust to economic change.
All right, thank you. So the next question is to Mr. Fujii. You talked about the rules on the digital trade. How emerging awareness of national security and so-called economic security impacts the digital trade issues, including the concept of DFFT.
Thank you. So, national security is very tricky. Yes. After the end of the Cold War, the concept of national security evolved beyond the traditional military defense interest into a multifaceted concept. As a result, various trade restrict measures were implemented under the stated purpose of national security. And in fact, we have seen an emerging trend of tightening control on data and the related facilities based on national security and other closely related policies. And starting with China has adopted a holistic view of national security, and based on such, its cybersecurity law requires that the critical information infrastructure operators conduct security assessments when providing personal information and important data outside of its territory. The scope of the term important data seems very wide and even includes information on vehicle flows, technological data that directly affect international competitiveness, and that data may affect political security, economic security, cultural security, and so on. And here in the US has started to restrict use of certain Chinese ICT and software, and the US implemented the executive order on securing the information and communication technology and service supply chain in the Trump era, and it has recently been amended to add connected software applications to its scope. It also issued the executive order on protecting American sensitive data from foreign adversaries. The US administration attempted to prohibit transactions with ByteDance TikTok and Tencent WeChat, and prohibited transactions with developers of 8 Chinese applications such as Alipay. And under the CFIUS investment screening regime, it has been clarified that the review will carefully consider American people's sensitive data. And turning to Japan, awareness regarding economic security has been growing in Japan in recent years, and in the last months, the METI published the related action plan. Key feature includes enhancement of cybersecurity and data policies, and it states that it is important to designate data that should be protected beyond the general protection level and adopt a specific protection measure. So with the expansion of the concept of national security, preventing abuse of security exemption becomes very relevant, and it seems prudent to rely on the carefully calibrated WTO discipline in this context. The WTO panel, which adjudicated the scope of national security exemption under GATT for essential security interests, interpreted that the members invoking such exemption owe an obligation of good faith, and that such good faith obligation mandates that the measure at issue meet a minimum requirement of plausibility for what is essential security interests and how the measure protects these security interests. The CPP's national security exemption has very similar wording to the said GATT article, and it is natural to interpret that the good faith obligation will also apply here. As a consequence, if a country intends to introduce cross-border data transfer restriction for national security reasons, it should clarify what the country's essential security interests are and how the restriction relates to those security interests. As such, while the CPTPP security exemption provides the member country with discretion as to the situation to which security exceptions apply, the good faith obligation may to some extent prevent the exception from being expanded indefinitely. This seems to hit the right balance. And in this regard, we should be mindful that several experts have pointed out that the cross-border data transfer restrictions are not necessarily effective for achieving security. They may increase vulnerability against cyber attack. They may interfere with legitimate international cooperation for military, intelligence, security, and law enforcement. This concludes my response.
Thank you so much. So question to Dr. Manuk. The workers' rights does seem to be considered very important in the U.S. trade law. In particular, IPEF supply chain agreement says that strengthened workers' rights would lead to resilience of supply chain. Could you please explain why?
Thank you. So the IPEF supply chain. It's fine? Okay, there we go. Perfect. So thank you for that question. The IPEF supply chain agreement has provisions in it related to addressing facility-specific labor rights inconsistencies. Just make sure I got that right in my head. It borrows heavily from the United States, Canada, Mexico agreements, similar mechanism, which is annexed to Chapter 31, the dispute settlement chapter. Important things to consider. IPEF does not have a dispute settlement chapter. IPEF is not a trade agreement. So how do you carry over provisions from a trade agreement that functions very differently in the dispute settlement context into something that is not? So in terms of how it's going to function, it's anyone's guess. So we'll see. But also what's really interesting is that it picks parts of the USMCA rapid response mechanism that I think leaves a lot of questions needing to be answered. Mainly in the sense that the lack of transparency in the RRM has been a persistent issue that experts have raised, including myself, as to why it may not be functioning as intended. The idea in the USMCA RRM was not to strengthen supply chains. It was actually to enforce labor rights violations in Mexico. So how we take that and now say it's going to strengthen supply chains, that's also a question I have that's not been answered. In theory, strong labor rights are very positive for resilient supply chains because when investors are going to take their money somewhere, they want to ensure that they're going to have a degree of stability, that the workers are going to be treated well and not face any sort of violations of other labor laws domestically or internationally. So it is important for firms, particularly if they care a lot about their image, which is very important, their brand, as we've seen what's happened throughout the world in terms of different sort of factory fires like in Bangladesh and elsewhere about where worker rights were not protected. So I think firms actually have an incentive themselves to care a lot about this. They don't always do it when they should. So can these rules actually incentivize firms to care? I'm not quite sure because of the way it's structured. So this is considered like a facility-specific mechanism. But one of the problems is that nowhere in the text does it say that the alleged facility will also be afforded any due process rights in trying to figure out whether or not an inconsistency was made or not. In addition to that, there's a bit of obscurity in the application saying that neither the notifying party or the party that is being alleged to have violated some of these rules will be needing to disclose publicly the allegation or the resolution to that allegation. So the way for us to measure whether or not this is effective is also not there if we don't have the data to evaluate it publicly. In addition to that, unlike the USMCA rapid response mechanism where you know the facility that's being alleged to be in violation, it's made public, here that's not the case, and instead we have a sector that can be identified as the sector that's alleged in violation. So we end up naming and shaming potentially an entire sector in a country that could make firms not want to invest there. And that, I think, it raises some questions about whether we're actually improving resilience or undermining it to some extent by not getting countries to trade and invest in IPEF partner countries. So I think there's a lot of issues that we have to resolve, and maybe that'll become clearer this week in the trade pillar as well, if that complements what we see in the supply chain pillar. But I have to say, Senator Sherrod Brown last week said he wanted the trade pillar gone because it wasn't strong enough on labor. So that tells me that it's not going to be what most Democrats are hoping for.
Thank you so much. So the last question is to Professor Kawase. There are some, newcomers requesting to participate in CPTPP, including China, Taiwan. How we should handle, how CPTPP should handle these admission requests. Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, it's working. Working, right? Okay, good. Thank you very much. And so I'd like to raise 3 points right here. The bottom line is that CPTPP should be open to any economy, especially the APEC economies. Because CPTPP is established to be the stepping stone to the FTAAP, FTAP, and any APEC member is eligible to join. So we should not, close the door to the China, just because she's China, but without, prejudice to the so-called one China principle. China is also required, not to obstruct, Taiwan's accession. And the second point is, having said that, before the accession process begins, China must seize the economic coercion. When CPTPP members decided to start the accession process of the UK, they took note of its history as a supporter of the rule-based trading system. So this means that the member of the CPTPP considered so-called track record of the applicant to be very important. So moreover, the high standard of their rule must not be compromised. as stated in the 2019, the TPP committee decision on accession, an applicant must not only demonstrate the means to comply with all the existing CPTPP rules, but also offer a market access of the highest standard. And the experts have pointed out, and I myself have found, the many potential difficulties in China's compliance with the CPTPP, particularly in area of the state enterprises, the digital trade and government procurement, intellectual property and labor. So without, addressing all these issues, China will not be accepted into the CPTPP, and this rule applies to any other applicant. And a long national list of the exception will not be unacceptable, and also the national security exception cannot be used as a loophole. We should note the three principles for accession, namely the high standard, consensus, and the track record, and all these shared by all CPTPP members. Then we also need to establish a mechanism to the China's implementation of the commitment, which is similar to, but more effective than the transitional review mechanism established when China joined in the WTO in the year 2001. And finally, the expansion of the membership must not prevent the U.S. from rejoining, coming back to the CPTPP. Look at the RCEP. The India is guaranteed an expedited and simplified future accession as an original negotiating member through the attached, ministerial declarations. So similar approach can be taken in the CPTPP for this purpose. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everybody, all the panelists, to excellent remarks and the presentations in spite of my poor time management. And it's the end of the session, and I would like.
You should take at least one question.
Yeah,
because the audience has been, but
please.
Very, very brief, please.
Very brief question. Good question. Good and easy question, please.
Hi, I'm Alan Jones, student at Georgetown. So very briefly, do you have any insights into the Yoon Kishida joint Stanford lecture this Friday?
I can take that very quickly. I think that this is another opportunity for that continued rapprochement between Japan and South Korea, and the fact that they're going to meet, and there is a discussion about boosting supply chains in ammonia, and that they'll visit Stanford together. I think that's all positive signs.
Okay. It's all? It's, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So,
thank you so much. And could you please join me in applauding to all the panelists?
Thank you, everyone. As you saw, we had a really robust discussion throughout the morning. We covered a lot, but with so much depth. So I want to thank the panelists in both sessions for sharing their insights. I want to thank especially the audience for staying with us, engaged. And there's no better incentive for speakers here to see how much interest there is from the audience. And I also want to thank the Japan Economic Foundation and Chairman Toyoda in particular. We really enjoyed working with all of you. So have a great rest of the day, and thank you for joining us today. Thanks.